Hi, I'm Raleigh Brown, and today we're going to do a lesson on the discussion of where blues meets jazz. There's a long continuum there, and somewhere in the middle there's a big blurry place, and that's what we're going to talk about. Before we get started, let's make sure you're in tune. So I'm going to play the strings and name the strings. If you remember the names, it'll make communication easier as we go on in the video. So the first string, or high E. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a way of taking a really basic blues chord progression, and we're going to look at your basic 12-bar blues in the key of E, and how you could jazz that up and turn it into a jazzier tune. And there's a real specific jazz tune we'll get to here in a little bit. So first I want to define this chord progression. You're going to have a measure of the E7 chord, which is the 1 chord, a measure of the A7 chord, then 2 measures of the E7. This is the 4th measure, 2 measures of the A7, 2 measures of the E7, 1 measure of the B7, which is the 5 chord, 1 measure of the A7, which is the 4 chord, and then the turnaround, which is 2 measures long, 1 of E and 1 half E and half B7. And so if I played that, I just wanted it to be really basic there. But if I was playing it in a little more musical way, it might be something like this. That's one time through a 12-bar blues. Okay, so what we're going to do is take that progression, and I will actually include a written, a PDF for you on this disc that will give you that 12-bar blues, and then it'll show you right underneath it what we're substituting to make it a more complicated chord progression. And I'm going to give you a very specific one. And one of the things about this, and this is also an interesting thing to understand when we start to talk about this is a jazzier progression and it's a little more sophisticated, we also want something that holds it together, that there's some kind of line that you hear in it that makes it seem unified. And a lot of times that line is the bass movement. So in this one, I'm going to talk you through it, and I'll show you the bass movement as we go. So we're going to have an E for 2 beats, and then an E7. Now, you could do this a lot of ways. I use the kind of jazz fingering, which is 4th fret, thud, and then 2, 4, 3. And if you wanted to identify this in a familiar way, you could think of it as kind of like a D7 here with my left hand, that you moved up 2 frets, and then you moved up the open string, which would give you this, and then you put this on the bass, because we need that bass string in there. If you don't want to be bothered with this jazzier fingering, you could learn this fingering, just these 2 fingers, and use your thumb to get this G sharp. So you could go. And then from there, we're going to go to an A7. And I'd love you to learn some of these jazz chords, even if you're not primarily a jazz player now. Part of the thing of learning the guitar is increasing your vocabulary of chords and melodic motifs. So this A7 is 5, thud, 5, 6, 5, thud. So when we're playing fingerstyle, those thuds are just notes you don't play. And if you're playing with a flat pick, you just have to be lazy enough so that you don't hear all those notes. Instead, you just get that to thud. Doesn't matter which way you do it, but you got to get that sound like that. And then, so now we have E, E7, A7, and then we want to raise that bass note to be an A sharp, and that makes the chord an A sharp diminished, which now is going to be 6, thud, 5, 6, 5. And then back to an E7. Now we're going to use an E7 up here. And I want this bass. So now our bass line goes. Okay? And so the chords. And then that's the end of our first line. 1, 2, 3, 4 would take us into the beginning of the second line where we need our A chord for 2 measures. And we're going to go back to our A7 again to get there, but we're going to use a little device, which is a very commonly used device, and on the guitar, it's a great little fingering. I've used it in previous videos, and it's, it's unavoidable when you've done, over a dozen of these DVDs that I'm going to repeat some parts here, which if you own all my DVDs, which is a great idea, you will have heard little bits of these before. So one of the ways of using chord substitution, a more sophisticated way of combining your chords or creating tonal colors, is that if you're going from a 1 chord, in this case our E7, to a 4 chord, in this case our A7, if we thought of the A7 as if it were the 1 chord, then in the key of A we would have A, B, C sharp, D, E, and the 2 would be B. And the 2 chord in a harmonized scale is always a minor, so we would pretend this is a 1 chord and do a 2-5-1 in A. And the 2-5-1 would be B minor, E7, which would be the 5 chord in A, but of course is the 1 chord in the key we're in. And that leads you into the A7. So that's like the difference between going so instead we want to go our 2 measures of E7, and the second one we're going to do, and that's going to lead us into the A7. So now I'm going to show you the specific fingerings we're using, and this is 7, thud, 7, 7, 5. And what that gives you is a B minor 11, because this is the 4th in the key of B minor, which is the same thing as an 11. And then we bring these 2 down, so you have 6 thud, 6, 7, 5, and that gives you an E7 flat 5, and that gives us a bass line that goes. So now we have this much. And then we have our A7. Now we're going to have 2 measures of this. The first measure is going to be our A7. The second measure is, just like we did previously, our A sharp diminished. Okay, and then here's our E again. And this next part could be negotiated a bunch of different ways, but this first time through, we're going to negotiate it as what we call cycle of fifths movement, in which each chord is the 5th of the chord that follows it. So we're an E, we start the cycle of fifths movement with C sharp 7, and it's just like our E except move down 3 frets. And then that's going to lead to an F sharp 7, which is just like our A7 shape, move down 3 frets. And then that leads us to B7, which in this case I would just use a regular open kind of cowboy chord B7. And this is our 5 chord. And then that leads us to the turnaround. And the turnaround is going to be a more compressed version of that. E, C sharp 7, F sharp 7, B 7. So now the whole progression will sound like this. Here comes our turnaround. And then back into the beginning again. And of course that term turnaround means that it takes you to a place where it creates tension and turns it back around to the beginning of the progression again. Now I'm going to add one more little twist in here, that when we do this structure, which we've already had, where we're going to play a C sharp 7, and then a F sharp 7, C sharp 7 and F sharp 7, then I can do my same little structure here where I play actually what is a G sharp minor 11th and then C sharp 7 flat 5. You don't even need to know the names, you just need to know the fingering. It's the same as the one we did up here. So this is 4 thud 4 4 2, 3 thud 3 4 2, and then that leads us to the F sharp. So now the whole progression will sound like this. And so there you have a kind of 12-bar blues explicated into a jazzier form. And that progression works great on a tune like Route 66. You could go right through it, and that's the whole tune except for the bridge. And then we could do a lot of fingering variations on that. And one of the other things which I didn't mention right at the outset about how we're going to jazz things up is, you've already seen a little of it, is the use of more sophisticated chord shapes. So in early jazz, you might have heard a lot of stuff where you would just have your E7, then you'd have your C sharp 7, then you'd have your F sharp 7, then you'd have your B7. As things get later, you get more of these altered tones, like a flat 5th, and then here we have an 11th, and then a flat 5th, and you get a much more sophisticated harmonic structure, and that's one of the things that developed in jazz as it went along, and particularly that idea of flat 5s. The flat 5s were considered a much more hip sound than the kind of straight ahead thing, and there was a kind of schism in the jazz world where what are called trad jazz or traditional jazz, which we normally think of as Dixieland players, disparaged the use of these flat 5s by the modern bebop guys, and in turn were disparaged for not using them. Anyhow, so that's a look at that first progression. And of course, if you don't want to use these jazzy chords, there are ways to negotiate this which are closer to fingerings that you're comfortable with. So you could actually play through this. You could do E7 or E. You could just reach up here and get your E7. You could do an A7 in the open position. Just add this B flat note on the 5th string and maybe add the 7th up here. And then you'd have your E again. Then you could have a B minor 7 into E7. Then you could have your regular A7 and your A sharp diminished again. Here, you're pretty much stuck with going to this actually is just like your C7 chord with a low bass. Moved up a fret where it becomes the C sharp 7. You could use a bar here and play an F sharp, and play a B7 here or your open B7. So some of these, you still get most of the right notes there. I didn't have the 11th on the B minor. But there are kind of conventional fingerings used in each of these styles too. So in basic blues, you're more likely to see first position chords or fragments of other chords. In jazz, there is a very strong bias towards playing closed position chords. And it's partially because there's a strong bias towards playing these tunes in the keys that are comfortable for horn players. Because jazz really grew up it didn't grow up as a guitar-based musical style. It really grew up as orchestral or small combo stuff with horn players who were used to playing in the flat keys, in E flat, B flat, F. And guitarists stuck playing in those keys because they're playing along with horn players, needed to use those closed positions, so they got very comfortable with them. For my money, I think if you're playing solo guitar, you should play in keys that are the most comfortable for you to play in, which is why I'll be doing these tunes today. We'll go into a couple different keys and try some other stuff, but definitely we're not going to go searching for keys that are harder than they need to be. Okay, so as I said, we will give you some printed materials where you'll be able to see a one-on-one comparison. E chord, E chord, E7, E7, or no, it'd be E chord, E chord, A chord, and then we'd have A7, A sharp diminished, E, E, and then we'd have B minor 7, E7 flat 5, and for the jazz part. So you'll have all these comparisons where you can see how that works. In the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this progression because there are jazzy, bluesy chord things that come into that cycle of fifths place, which we'd like to talk about too. Okay?